Liberty in our lifetimes in a free state of our own. That's the vision. That's the dream. And we are building it in New Hampshire. I'm Eric Breakaway, your host and renegade statesman for the Porcupine Report. Welcome to your source for porcupine news and free-range conversation on matters of liberty. All right, let's hop into the show. Hello and welcome, everyone. Your host, your renegade statesman, your executive director of the Free State Project, Eric Breakaway, here to welcome you to episode 32 of the Porcupine Report, coming to you every single Wednesday with a new episode at 7 o'clock p.m. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is going to be a good episode, a conversation I've been looking forward to for a little while. But before we get to that, a few things I want to report to you. You know, I just got back from last night. I was out door knocking, actually, for Emily Phillips. This is in my personal capacity, not on behalf of the Free State Project, which is a 501c3 organization. But Emily Phillips, great candidate running for the state Senate. And it was so encouraging to see how many folks are active and engaged in trying to take a proactive role in keeping New Hampshire free. And particularly standing for candidates who support things like that we promote on this program, like Defend the Guard, defending our National Guard troops from being sent over wars and overseas into wars that haven't been declared by Congress, and for basic education freedom and basic transparency in government. So thank you to everyone who's being involved. I know the primaries are next week, so thank you to those who are helping good candidates. I also want to mention to you that we did just this weekend, as I've been promoting, we had the Free State Bitcoin Digital Asset Conference in Durham, New Hampshire. It was well attended. The weather was beautiful and a lot of great speeches. I personally learned a lot from a lot of speakers who are far more knowledgeable than I am on the state of cryptocurrency policy on the national level and also the technical the technical aspects of Bitcoin and digital assets and where things are. And I gave some remarks I think we'll be getting up online in the near future about how the monetary revolution is here. It's both here in a literal, in a temporal sense. The time has come. The monetary system that we've had for so long is starting to unravel, and there's an opportunity for something new. But also in a physical, geographic sense, it's here in New Hampshire, where so many folks are gathered, networked together, working to build a free society. So look for those remarks coming. We'll put them out online sometime in the near future. And I will also mention, if you are not currently subscribed to the Free State Project newsletter, we release, I personally write it with the help of many great volunteers, a monthly newsletter on the goings-on in the Free State and good events that are coming forward in the future. If you're not currently getting the Free State Project newsletter, then you're missing out. So you're going to want to go to fsp.org and sign up. Make sure you're getting that in your email inbox every single month, so you can keep on top of what's happening in the land of the free. Anyway, those are the things I have to report. Before we get to our conversation for today's show, I want to. We have a sponsor for today's episode, and I want to thank our sponsor for today's show, and that is Firewalker Kava, based right here in the Free State and shipping across the country. Do you know about kava? Kava is a plant from the Pacific Islands, cherished for centuries for its ability to calm the mind, ease stress, and help you relax without clouding your thoughts. Firewalker Kava has taken this ancient tradition and made it easier than ever to enjoy. They offer little bites of relaxation with their upside-down pineapple kava extract gummies, pure, potent, and fast-acting kava extract that you can mix into your favorite non-alcoholic beverage. And for the traditional kava enthusiasts, their signature kava blend featuring two single cultivars expertly blended for a balanced kava experience, perfect for socializing with friends or unwinding after you've invited them to come and relocate to New Hampshire. As a vendor at Free State events, I personally sampled their signature blend at PorcFest and the New Hampshire Liberty Forum, and I enjoyed it so much that I actually bought some and brought it home with me. Looking forward to making some in the near future. But that's not all. Firewalker Kava is part of a family of brands. Their sister company, Art of Kava, offers traditional single cultivar kavas, bringing you the authentic kava experience in its purest form. If you are a tea lover, Yum Cha Tea Company creates unique teas that pair beautifully with kava for a soothing, flavorful experience that lets you relax and enjoy the moment. And if you happen to be in Garden City, Idaho, or you are close enough that you could move your state's border there, visit them at Karuna Kava and Tea, a local kava bar where relaxation and community meet. Please note that kava may not be suitable for everyone. Consult your doctor before use and use responsibly. And you can visit their website for more information and check out their products at firewalkerkava.com and use promo code FIREWALKER to save 10% on your order. Thank you to the folks at Firewalker Kava for sponsoring this episode. All right, back into the show. All right. I am really looking forward to our guest that we're about to welcome on. As I mentioned before, this is a conversation I've been looking forward to for a little while. I've been very curious about what they've been doing out there. And I guess I've been keeping it a little vague. So let me just tell you, his name is Matt McCaw. He is the executive director of the Greater Idaho Movement. And what is the Greater Idaho Movement, you ask? I guess we're going to find out in a bit. But I will tell you about Matt. He's a father of 8. He's a small businessman, and he is a lifelong Oregonian who I imagine, like many in the rural parts of Oregon, just like folks who I know in the rural parts of Maine, I get pretty frustrated when cosmopolitan progressive cities seem to be running everything in their state and trampling on their rights and their freedoms. And so that's where the Greater Idaho Movement comes from. So let's welcome to the show, Matt McCaw. Glad to have you on the Porcupine Report.
Thank you, Eric. It's good to be here.
Pleasure's all mine. I'll tell you, I've never actually been out to Oregon. How is it out there, aside from the politics?
It's beautiful. The weather's great. We have a great climate. We have mountains, ocean, desert. We have just about everything you could have. It's a wonderful place to live. I've lived here my whole life. I lived on the west side of our state, which is wet and urban. I've lived on the east side of the state, which is dry and rural. It's a great place. We just have a state governance problem in our state. And that's why the Greater Idaho Movement exists. For people that don't know, the state of Oregon is divided by the Cascade Mountain Range, which cuts right kind of down the middle of it. And on the west side of those mountains, it's a completely different geography, completely different climate, and a completely different culture than on the east side of those mountains. And it's always been that way from the founding of Oregon 170 years ago. The people on the east side didn't want to necessarily be grouped with people on the west side right from the beginning because the cultures were different and they knew that the geography, the climate, they were going to develop differently. Didn't really make sense. But as a precursor to what was going to happen over the course of the next 170 years, they were outvoted by the urban centers on the west side of the state that said, we want a big footprint, so we're going to put the border here and force you people on the east side to be grouped with us. It's caused problems ever since, and we are trying to right that wrong with the Greater Idaho Movement now.
So let me ask you, so in Oregon, I mean, I've never been out there. I do remember as a young kid playing Oregon Trail, and that was my kind of experience in Oregon.
Absolutely.
Died of dysentery a few times, but I know in pop culture, when I think of Oregon, I think of like the show like Portlandia, which is kind of a parody on like Portland, Oregon culture, which frankly, sometimes I often joke with people in Maine that could have easily been about Portland, Maine as well. But what's the issue exactly? So the people in kind of the west side of Oregon are more progressive. What they want to have more progressive governance governing their lives, but certainly they're not coming over there and trampling on your freedoms and messing with your life, right? What problem could you possibly have with all the progressives on the coast, just trying to have the kind of government they want?
If that were the case, Eric, we wouldn't need this movement because the people out here in Eastern Oregon would have the policy that they want. But as we all know, that's not the case. You're being facetious. This is not the way that progressive politics works in these big urban centers. Oregon has about 4 million people. 2 million of them, about half of them, live in the Portland metro area, which is one of the most left-leaning, progressive, population centers in the entire United States. So it's so big, It dominates state politics. All of state offices in Oregon are Democrat held. The legislature is single party Democrat ruled. So what happens in the state of Oregon, even though you get outside of Portland, you get outside of the metro area in the Willamette Valley, and the rest of the state's pretty conservative and it's very rural. And you get over here on the east side of the state and we're very conservative. People vote 75% Republican out here on the east side. But we get policy forced on us from the west side of the state that we don't want, that we don't vote for, that doesn't make sense for our communities and harms our communities. And this is something that's been going on, like I said, for a long time. There's different needs and different expectations from the urban west side of the state that don't work for us on the east side of the state. But this really came to a head, Eric. Our movement is about 4 years old, and it coincided with the rise of COVID and the COVID craziness and the oppressive COVID policies that were forced onto us. So Oregon, like a lot of coastal states, just went over the top on their COVID policies, shut down schools, shut down churches, shut down businesses, declared some people essential and other people not essential, forced people into masks, later on forced people to take vaccines or lose their jobs. And it was just heavy-handed government, and it was all over the state. And while that was government that people in the northwest part of the state, they tolerated and they seemed to be somewhat okay with that. Out here in Eastern Oregon, it was, people hated it. And it caused just a massive amount of conflict and tension because people out here didn't want their kids. They wanted their kids in school. They wanted their businesses open. They wanted to go to church. And our state forced this on us with the threat of punishment if we didn't obey. And it caused just a massive amount of tension. And it was one of those things that kind of, triggered people to say, hey, we got to do something about this. Has been a problem for a long time, but now that government's going to do these incredibly oppressive and damaging things to our lives, we got to do something about it. And our movement kind of took off, and we've gone to 13 counties now in Eastern Oregon and asked voters over the last 4 years, asked voters in 13 counties if they want their elected leaders to pursue becoming part of Idaho. We've won in all 13 of those counties. The people of Eastern Oregon are ready for something different. They're ready to get out from Western Oregon policy. And our proposal makes a ton of sense. We border Idaho, which is an incredibly conservative state. So while Oregon is this very, very left-leaning liberal state, Idaho is one of the most conservative states in the country. And it borders us. And the climate and the geography and the economy and the culture of Idaho is the same as the people of Eastern Oregon. We probably always should have been part of Idaho, but now the people are rising up and saying, we are demanding of our elected leaders that they have this conversation. We would rather get our state governance from these people that much better match our values than from the people of Western Oregon.
Well, I'll say that's one of the most impressive things to me about the Greater Idaho Movement is it's one thing to have an idea. It's another thing when you have, popular votes from 13 counties saying we want to actually pursue this idea. I guess I saw some of the news popping off about counties that have voted for this. What are the margins of these votes? Are they overwhelming? Are they close? I imagine, a decision to change the state border is not a decision people make lightly. What's been that process been? And I guess I'm amazed too that you were even able to get this on the ballots in the counties. I can't imagine the state government was happy with that, even being a question that people were asked. Were there any roadblocks that were in your way to letting people vote on this?
Absolutely. So we've had a ton of roadblocks, but it all goes back to when we started this movement, and I wasn't involved in the movement at the time. This was a grassroots organization. It was a group of people meeting around a pizza parlor table and trying to figure out how to solve this urban-rural divide that we've had in the state for as long as any of us have been alive. The decision was made then they came up with this idea. Let's move the border. It's an imaginary line. It's a political tool that we use to group similar peoples for political governance reasons. So that invisible line and just move. So these people, they said, well, we've got this good idea, but let's go find out if that's what the people of Eastern Oregon actually want. And so the decision was made to go directly to voters. And in Oregon, we can do that through the initiative process. We can put questions on the ballot in front of voters if we can gather enough signatures of registered voters in those counties. So that was what we initially did is we started going out to these counties and saying, we want to put this question on the ballot. We met a lot of resistance from county clerks. As it turns out, there's a lot of legal, kind of subtleties as to how those questions have to be asked and what they have to look like. But in the end, what we've been able to do is go to 13 counties and ask them, essentially, do you want your elected leaders to pursue moving the border? And we are winning. Our average is about 58% across those 13 counties. And we won one county by 8 votes. We won another county with 76% of the vote. So, it kind of varies depending on the different county. But as a whole, we're 13 for 13. We're averaging about 58%. And it's clear that the people of Eastern Oregon are ready for their elected leaders to have this conversation.
Well, it's amazing that you've got majorities, some strong majorities and some close majorities county by county. But I know, inspired by what I see happening over in Oregon, I know, and thinking about some of our problems on the East Coast in Maine, I know I looked back in kind of history and looked up the vote totals for when the people of Maine voted county by county to separate from Massachusetts. And I saw one county where it was just a slight margin of just a few votes. So, hey, a majority is a majority. And it's impressive that that this is building in this way. What has been the, I guess, across the border in Idaho? What do people in Idaho have to say about it? Do they say, oh, we don't want these Oregonians coming over here and being part of our state government? Maybe they'll bring those Oregon values and maybe they're mistaking you for, or are they recognize these are our kind of like-minded, like similar-minded Americans we'd love to have kind of as part of the state of Idaho. What's the reaction over there?
Well, it's a little bit of both, but primarily the polling that's been done in the state of Idaho showed that Idahoans over 2-1 are in favor of adding Eastern Oregon counties that have voted to decide to join Idaho. If those counties can join without being an economic burden, which there's been an independent economic analysis done by a group out of Moscow, Idaho, that showed that Eastern Oregon counties joining Idaho would be a plus for Idaho state tax, coffers, and it would take the economies of Eastern Oregon, and those economies would take off, getting out from the repressive regulations and environmental regulatory rules of Oregon and getting into a freer state like Idaho. This economist predicted that the economies of Eastern Oregon would take off. So Idahoans, when asked in polling, are heavily in favor of this, over 2-1. We also have been to the Idaho legislature, and the Idaho legislature, the House in the Idaho legislature already passed a memorial inviting the state of Oregon to begin border talks. So elected leaders see what you were saying is exactly right. Idaho sees these Eastern Oregonians. They see people that are culturally similar, vote the same way they do, or make their living the same way, want the same things for their communities. And one of the fears in states like Idaho is that you get your urban centers, because what tends to happen in states is these urban centers grow and they get more left-leaning and they get more power across the state. And before you know it, your once rural state that was pretty conservative is now, trending blue. And that's a concern. Idaho is very conservative. Idahoans want to stay very conservative. Adding 400,000 like-minded voters that vote the same way they do is a huge plus for the state of Idaho. And adding all the land and resources, with COVID, Idaho became one of the fastest growing states in the country. And it's because if you're a conservative person or freedom-loving person in Washington, Oregon, California, COVID, it was not bearable, it was not tolerable to a lot of people to continue living in those states. So they were looking for, where's the closest conservative state that is not doing this, repressive government, regulations on everything. And that was Idaho. So people poured into Idaho, and in Idaho, the Treasure Valley there with Boise and Meridian is just exploded. And so this would give Idaho much more room to grow. People wouldn't have to go into Boise to get to Idaho governance. They could come to Central Oregon, which is beautiful and has a ton of room for growth. And it wouldn't put that social strain on Idaho that is currently happening because of all of the people that are escaping these leftist blue states and pouring into Idaho. So there's huge advantages to the state of Idaho. The people see it, and the government, the elected leaders see it. So, Idaho has basically said, we are ready to have this negotiation with the state of Oregon as soon as the state of Oregon is willing to have the conversation about letting these people go. Our stumbling block has been the people in charge in Oregon, the elected leaders of Oregon, have not shown any willingness to let the people of Eastern Oregon, choose their own governance.
Yeah. So there's not an appetite for them to release their hostages.
Not currently. And that's part of why, it's so important that we get out there and that people across the country see what's happening here. We have a situation, you don't have to go far across the world to find a situation where there's people that are saying, we want to choose different governance because this governance is not working for us. And we have a right as free people to self-determination and to choose what kind of government we want to govern us. That's happening right here in the United States, in Eastern Oregon. The people of these counties are saying, we want to join Idaho, but they're being stopped because the political process is that the state of Oregon has to let us go. We can't just declare it and it's over. The state of Oregon has to say, yes, you can go be part of Idaho. We will agree with Idaho to move the border. And right now the state of Oregon is blocking that.
So before we talk about the higher up officials in Oregon state government and their reactions to it a little bit more, which I'm very curious about. What have you seen as far as the reaction of just regular people on the western side of Oregon who live in these progressive cities to the idea? Are they more inclined to say, well, you want to leave us? Good. Get out of here. If you don't want to be married to us, we don't want to be married to you, or not? Is there from regular people on the ground in these progressive cities? What are you seeing there?
So again, we get a mix of reviews. We'll get people that say, nobody's going to take my Oregon. They see that they own Eastern Oregon, even though they don't. Or Oregon governs. The state of Oregon governs Eastern Oregon. It does not own the land out here. The federal government owns about half the land out here, and the people who live here own the other half. But they're governed by the state. But there's people that they know that shape on the map, and that's very important to them. They're lifelong Oregonians, and they can't bear the thought of the eastern part of our state being part of another state. So we get that. But the polling that's been done, there has been polling done in Western Oregon. So polling that was done by Survey USA asked people in Western Oregon a lot of questions. But at the end, they said, the question at the end was, if the people of Eastern Oregon vote to leave Oregon and join Idaho, should the state of Oregon let them? And people in Western Oregon, it wasn't a majority, it wasn't over 50%, but it was more people, like 46% said, yes, we should let them, than said, no, we shouldn't. And then, of course, there was this undecided vote. But what that told us was that for most people, Eric, most people don't look at politics, I think, as the way that people in politics do, which is blue team, red team. It's always a game of who's got the most seats, who's got the most power, who can impose their will, who can pass, do we have the votes to do this? And that's what people inside political systems that's the way they view things. But your everyday person who's just living their lives, they're not focused on politics. They're focused on their family. They're focused on their business and their church and about doing the things in life that are meaningful, like watching your kids grow and play sports and be in plays. And so what they really want is they want government that allows them to have the kind of community where they're safe and where they feel like they can thrive and their families can thrive. And your everyday person is not concerned about somebody that lives hundreds of miles away, which in Oregon, we're a huge state. So when we're talking about, we have people in Oregon that are 250 miles from the state capital. It's a gigantic state. Your everyday person in Western Oregon, they're not worried about an Eastern Oregonian and their community. They're worried about their own community, and they understand that it doesn't make any sense for Portland to be dictating policy government to people that live hundreds of miles away in little towns that make their living completely different, that their whole way they structure their community is completely different. So your everyday person is supportive of this idea in Western Oregon. And that is not, we don't think that's the problem. The problem is breaking into that political, like I said, the two teams, red team, blue team, because we have had pushback even from, you would think out here in Eastern Oregon, people only elect Republicans, basically. It's incredibly conservative. So you would think out here in Eastern Oregon that the people they elect would be very supportive of this movement. But it turns out that most of our elected leaders are not supportive of this movement. Most of our elected leaders don't want to go down this road for various reasons. But part of it is that the party, the Republican Party, which is already doesn't have a lot of power, would be even more powerless if they lost the voters and the representatives and the senators from Eastern Oregon. And so you have that where there's Western Oregon conservatives. They're like, we can't let you go because then we're really in trouble and we would be, a super minority. But again, that's not the majority of people. Most people are supportive of this idea. And most people, if you ask them, should people have the right to vote for the kind of government that makes sense for their communities? A vast majority of people would say, absolutely. That's what the democratic system is all about, and about allowing people to choose their own government.
Now, I don't know too much about your governor in Oregon. I imagine, what's your governor's name?
Governor Tina Kotek.
Tina Kotek. Okay.
Yeah.
I imagine she's probably not the most sympathetic person to all of this. Has she acknowledged the existence of the Greater Idaho Movement and these votes taking place in her state, or is she pretending that it's not happening?
So both. So we had a governor's election a year ago, and we had three people running. We had a Republican, a Democrat, and an independent. And all three of those ladies, while they were running for governor, talked about our movement. And, in debates, that this comes up. You have 13 counties in your state that are saying, we don't like this state anymore. We want out. It's a pretty big deal. And all three of those candidates said, we hear the people of Eastern Oregon. We want to be a governor for the whole state. We want them to have, we don't like that they feel unheard or so we're going to sit down. We're going to, engage with these people. As soon as the election is over, we have not heard anything. So we have reached out to the governor. We've formally invited her to meet with us anywhere in Eastern Oregon, and sit down and talk about how to get better governance for the state, east side of the state. But she has, not responded. And we've reached out to every channel that we can, through every channel we can. She hasn't responded. And that's kind of been the how leadership at the state level has been. That's been the way that the legislature has dealt with us. They've basically said, we're not going to engage with the organization. They're not engaging with us, and we're not going to have this conversation. We're not going to allow bills to go into committee or to get any kind of hearings or anything. It's going to be, just dead on arrival. We're not having this conversation.
If you were to somehow get beyond this hurdle of the Democrats in charge of your current state government, is that it? I mean, does it just Idaho and Oregon that need to agree to this, or does Congress have to give a stamp of approval? Like, I know Congress would have to, if I know the folks in Northern California for the longest time have been trying to break away and become their own separate state, the state of Jefferson. I know that would not just require consent of California, but it would also require consent of Congress. But of course, this is different, right? This doesn't really affect the balance of power in the U.S. Senate. There's going to be the same number of U.S. senators. A new state is not created, just the border shifts. Does Congress have to sign off on this as well, or is this just between the two parties?
No, Congress would. So you are correct. So the process is an interstate compact, which is basically a contract between two states. And that's how you move a border. And borders, there's a precedence for it. Borders have moved multiple times throughout the history of the United States. Oregon and Washington actually used this exact process to move their border in 1958. It's a little known historical fact. People don't realize that the border didn't move very far, but there is a process there, but it does have to be signed off by Congress. But Eric, you brought up something really important, and that is, people ask us, well, why don't you just create your own state? Or why don't you do this? Or why don't you do that? And part of the reason that we chose this process, changing a state border, is because we understand that at the federal level, we are so polarized, and it is so, anything that's going to upset the balance of power at the federal level is going to be a non-starter for the federal government. Nobody thinks that the Democrat Party or the Republican Party are going to agree to just give up 2 Senate seats to create a new state. That's not going to happen unless you bring in some others. So maybe you could have a state of Eastern Oregon if you brought in a Puerto Rico or something that counters against it.
Yeah,
but
a Puerto Rico compromise, like the Missouri.
Yeah, but it's going to be messy. It's going to be complicated. Moving the border, like we're proposing, we're only talking about moving 400,000 people. So 400,000 people isn't even one full representative. So it's not even one House seat that you would be moving. When we redistrict in 2030, it would probably move one of the representatives that's currently in the state of Oregon to the state of Idaho. But even that is not completely clear based on population changes and whatnot. So the federal impact that our policy proposal has is incredibly minimal. At most, it's 1 electoral vote out of 538 electoral votes. So there would really be no reason. We don't see any reason why the U.S. Congress, if Oregon and Idaho came together and said, you know what, it would be a win for both of our states if we took this border from where it currently is, moved it 200 miles west to where it actually makes sense for it to go. That'd be a win for both of our states, and we both agree to it. It's hard to see why U.S. Congress would have a problem with that. And historically, interstate compacts have been approved by Congress because, again, if 2 states agree that they need to do something that's in the best interest of both those states, there's not a lot of reason for the U.S. Congress to say no to that. And so we wouldn't expect that would be a huge hurdle. The big hurdle is going to be getting the state of Oregon to come to the table.
Earlier you were talking about, I think in a bigger picture sense, this challenge I think we find repeated throughout human civilization of the urban-rural divide. When the cities become so populous and so politically powerful that the voices of folks in rural areas get stamped out. And I think you could even go back to like ancient Rome and find that this was part of the problem. I imagine a lot of states, not just Oregon, are dealing with this. As I mentioned before, when I hear this idea, I think a lot about the folks in the 2nd District of Maine and what they've been dealing with as the population centers in the South have grown more politically powerful and more progressive. I imagine that if this went through for the Greater Idaho Movement, it would get a lot of people around the country who are in similar positions thinking about, why do we have to keep these imaginary lines exactly where they are if it's not resulting in the kind of governments we'd like to live under? What thoughts do you have about the implications of this movement beyond just the effort for self-determination for the folks in Eastern Oregon?
Well, I think you make a great point, and I think you're exactly right. And we're not the only movement like this. There's actually several movements across the country that are like-minded people looking for ways to get better governance. And so, like, for instance, in Illinois, there's a group going on that's trying to move the rural counties away from the city of Chicago and those outlying counties, because Chicago dominates that state. Much like Portland dominates Oregon, you have one population center, and then you get downstate into the rest of the counties are very rural. They want very different things. It would make much more sense for them to get governance from either another state or their own state. There's movements like that. I think that once we are able to make this happen in Oregon, it's going to open people's eyes up to the fact that we can use political tools, all the political tools we have, to get better governance and lower the political temperature in our country. I think, I think people are eager for solutions, and people are, I think, starting to come to the conclusion that this is not going to work to just keep doing what we've always been doing. To just continue to, when blue team gets the votes, they're going to force their way of life on red team. And when red team gets the votes, we're going to force our way of life on blue team. That doesn't work. We want so different things. Our culture is really polarized. And Greater Idaho didn't cause that polarization. That is there. Greater Idaho is coming along as a solution and saying, if we're so culturally different, if we want such different things for our communities, then we need to figure out a way to get government for those communities that make sense for them. Otherwise, you're going to have conflict. You're going to have political tension, because it's not tolerable for people to live under some of the governance that's starting to happen. So one of the things people ask me is, well, why now? Why did Greater Idaho become a thing now? This has been an issue since day one. Since the day they put the border where they did, Eastern Oregonians felt like they were not represented in the state of Oregon. So why, after 170 years, is this movement taking off? And I think part of that is that our culture has gotten so different, and people's values have gotten so different, and what they find tolerable to live under is changing. And so, you know, we have like here in Oregon. Oregon's a very left-leaning state, so Oregon is very pro all LGBTQ stuff, all trans stuff, and that forced that policy into communities that are not that way. And so you have policy being forced on Eastern Oregon rural religious communities that are saying, you have to do this in your schools, you have to have this in your communities, and the people here are saying, that doesn't match our values. We don't want that. We can't live that way. We're not going to live that way. And that was something that we saw during COVID, is that it put people in a position where they had to either say, I'm going to go against my values, or I'm going to break the rules or the law that my state government's trying to force on me. And for us, that was, going to church. We were told you're not supposed to go to church. Well, at some point, not very long after we were told that, people in Eastern Oregon just said, we're going to church because we feel like that's what we're supposed to do. And so I don't care what the state says. I don't care if they punish us. We're going to do what we're going to do. And that's not a productive way to have a society. Like, that's not going to work long term. So we got to figure out ways to make sure Portland can have the kind of government that matches Portland values, that makes sense for Portland, the Portland community, but that people in Eastern Oregon can have the same thing without the conflict that is going to inevitably come if one of us tries to force our way of life on the other.
Now, you've spoken a lot about COVID, and COVID being a big trigger for the popular support for the Greater Idaho Movement, which makes sense to me. I think all of us who lived in states with very tyrannical lockdown regimes were looking for solutions out of that. But what other policies are in place in Oregon that have been, I guess, maybe even more longstanding, perhaps, but have been of significant kind of departure from the way the folks in Eastern Oregon would like to be governed? I guess, for example, what's the state of gun rights in Oregon right now?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Eric, and that is one of them. We've had two different measures that happened in the last statewide measures. So in Oregon, we have an initiative. You can put something to a popular vote across the state. So laws can be enacted through popular vote across the state. It doesn't have to happen through the legislature. And we've had a couple of those measures that were just toxic to the people of Eastern Oregon. And one of those was called Measure 114, and it was a gun restriction law. So people in Western Oregon, people in the Portland metro area, they're I don't know, maybe that's too strong to say they're anti-gun, but they want a lot of restrictions on people's Second Amendment rights.
I find that they're usually in favor of the government having guns.
Yes, right. Yes, but not your everyday citizen. And so people in Western Oregon said, we want all these restrictions on guns. We want to create registries so we know who's got guns in the communities. And they put this on a statewide ballot. So people in Western Oregon, if you live in Portland, I can understand why you might have these views, why you might think that's going to make your community better if there's some gun restrictions. But out here in Eastern Oregon, this is Second Amendment culture. People, we're very rural. Almost everybody hunts. Almost everybody owns guns and is comfortable with guns. People don't want restrictions on their firearms out here. So this measure 114, it went to a statewide vote. Every county in Eastern Oregon voted overwhelmingly against this. And I mean overwhelmingly. There were counties 75, 80% voted no on Measure 114, these gun restrictions. Western Oregon passed it. And because Western Oregon has 90% of the population in our state is in Western Oregon, and only 9% is in Eastern Oregon. So it doesn't really matter what Eastern Oregonians want. They can always be outvoted by the West side. They passed Measure 114. So there was sheriffs out here and local, police departments that said, we're not implementing, we can't implement this. We're not going to implement this. It instantly causes all this political tension. A judge in Eastern Oregon throws up a red flag, says this is unconstitutional. We're not implementing this policy. So we've got this mess. We've got this mess where we had this policy that the people in Western Oregon wanted, but they forced it on the people of Eastern Oregon. And because they were forcing it on the people of Eastern Oregon, now you've got the people of Eastern Oregon upset, and they blocked it so that the people of Western Oregon can't have the policy they all wanted. Again, this is no way to run society. Like, this is not a productive way to get people government that makes sense for them. It just causes anger on both sides of the issue. So that was an issue that was incredibly toxic in our state and really got people upset. Measure 110 was another statewide measure that legalized possession of hard drugs in the state. And again, this was a measure, came out of the Portland metro area, supported by the population centers there, voted against in every Eastern Oregon county. People in Eastern Oregon said, we don't want drugs in our community. We want to be able to, when we have people that are using drugs out in public, we want to be able to pick them up and get them off the streets. And we're afraid this is going to cause more crime and everything else. So everybody in Eastern Oregon, all the counties voted against it, but it passed because Western Oregon wanted it. It was implemented across the entire state, and it was a complete disaster. And to the point where they've repealed that now 2 years later, and they're backtracking on it. But it was one of those examples. People of Eastern Oregon said, we don't want this. Don't do this to our communities. This is going to harm our communities. And they said that as loudly as they could and in every way that they could, still had that policy forced on us. And that kind of stuff just creates enormous bitterness, amongst people. You're talking about the governor. Governor Kotek is, you can find in lots of different metrics, she's the least popular governor in the state or in the country. And Governor Brown, before that, was the least popular governor, and she's also our governor. But part of that, Eric, is because we are such a polarized state. We have these two sides of the state that have completely different value sets and want completely different things. So, of course, any governor is going to have a low approval rating in the state of Oregon because we're just so divided. And if we were to somehow if Republicans were somehow to get in charge in Oregon and start implementing conservative policy, Portland would have none of it. They would, they'd say that we're not doing this. We got to find a different way to solve these problems rather than just causing conflict every time somebody wins an election.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let me ask you on a practical sense, say we get over all the barriers that are there with your state government, and you get to the point where the border is shifting. As far as the laws that exist currently in Eastern Oregon, I mean, I imagine it'd be simple enough for some of them to change overnight to Idaho laws. Suddenly you don't have to register your guns. You get these freedoms back. But I imagine there are also a lot of laws that are in place that might be a little bit more complicated, how you kind of transition over from certain regulatory schemes to other regulatory schemes. In practical effect, what would that look like?
So that's hard to know because an interstate compact, we as a movement, we have proposed certain things. We think it would make sense if this happened when the border moves, but we really don't have the power to do any of that. That's going to be done by the two state legislatures. And you're right. There are things that are not that big a deal. What happens, people always, they have their own thing that they think about. And it's like, well, what's going to happen to my driver's license? Well, it'll probably, when it's due, you'll go get one in Idaho, or, you'll have 6 months or whatever. That probably won't be a big deal. There are going to be other things that are bigger deals. Idaho doesn't allow recreational marijuana, but state of Oregon does. And again, this is one of those situations when legalized recreational marijuana went on the ballot many years ago, all the counties in Eastern Oregon said, we don't want this, but it passed statewide, became policy against our will. Well, now that it's illegal, you have pot shops, you have people that grow cannabis, we have crops. Now, if we switch into Idaho governance, what do we do with this? We have people that have invested their whole lives into these businesses. We got a mess on our hands now that never needed to be there because the people out here never wanted it in the first place, but had it forced on us by governance that didn't match our values. And so there are going to be issues like that are going to be complicated. They're going to be difficult. We would imagine that there's going to be some grandfathering in of things. There's going to have to be some time to allow things. The minimum wage in Idaho is $7.50. Minimum wage in Oregon is over $15. So, what's going to happen there? It's like Are we just going to instantly go to 750? I'm not sure. That's going to have to be something. The two state legislatures have the resources to put together commissions, put together study groups to actually, investigate these things and come up with solutions that make the most sense. And that's, we will be supportive and helpful in that, but we don't really have the power to say, here's what's going to happen.
As you described the situation with cannabis in particular, I think, and the minimum wage too. I mean, I guess these are the exact questions when I've been watching what you guys are doing over there, and I'm thinking, okay, how would this work if you did something like this with Maine and New Hampshire? Of course, Maine also has adult use and medical cannabis, and wherever individuals are on the issue, I'm personally supportive of those programs, and have done a lot of work on medical during my time in the Senate. And I certainly would hate to see, businesses go up, particularly medical cannabis, where they're helping people. I guess these are some of the challenges you figure out as you kind of figure out how to reconcile that, if you can get to that point. As far as strategy, so obviously the big bottleneck for you is the existing government in Oregon. Sounds like you've been kind of running up against a brick wall with them. What strategies do you all have to try to get something to happen there?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So we've spent 4 years reaching out to legislators on both sides of the aisle, on both sides of the mountains. And our proposal is a win-win-win. It's a win for everybody involved. It's a plus for the state of Idaho. It's a plus for the people of Eastern Oregon. It's also a plus for the people of Western Oregon in a couple of ways. One, Eastern Oregon is a financial drain on Western Oregon. It's not as wealthy as Western Oregon is. So right now, tax dollars that are collected in Western Oregon get sent to subsidize Eastern Oregon. By letting us go be part of Idaho, where we wouldn't be a drain, we'd be about the same, economics and average GDP as Idaho counties already are. But by letting us go, Western Oregon would get to keep their tax dollars at home, use them on things that are specific to Western Oregon communities.
Can I ask you real quick? Is there also a built-in assumption that the greater economic freedom of being a part of Idaho would lead to more homegrown economic development in Eastern Oregon?
Absolutely. That economic analysis that I mentioned earlier, and there's a link to it on our website, it showed that if Eastern Oregon counties became part of Idaho, they predicted that our economic growth would surge up and above what you would expect to grow in a normal year because of exactly that: freer economic regulations, lower environmental regulations hampering businesses. So yeah, the Eastern Oregon counties, and one thing that they didn't account for that we think would happen as people that have lived here is that Central Oregon, Eastern Oregon is a beautiful place, and people would move here. There's people that live in Western Oregon that would love to live in a free red state, but moving 6 hours is a lot. It's a long ways. It's a long ways from family. You're talking about flying now instead of driving. If they only had to move 2 hours to get over the mountains to a free state, you would see people pour into these Central Oregon, what would be new border towns. We're confident of that, and those economies would surge. So there's a big economic advantage to Western Oregon, but also in probably even more importantly, Western Oregon is pretty like-minded. They want left-leaning policy. They want left-leaning government. That's what they want for their communities. That's fine. If that's what people in Western Oregon want, they think they need for their communities to thrive, they should have that. And they should have that without people in Eastern Oregon saying you can't have it. We live hundreds of miles away from them, and we're very different than they are. We shouldn't be telling them they can't have the kind of policy that makes sense for their communities, just like they shouldn't be telling us. And again, your everyday person agrees with that. They understand that it's common sense. So by letting Eastern Oregon go be part of Idaho, a state that better matches their values, Western Oregon could get the policy that makes sense for Western Oregonians, that Western Oregonians want, without Eastern Oregon interfering.
Awesome. Well, Matt, I really would love to see so much more of this kind of happening around the country. I think that people should get to have the kind of government they want to have. And of course,
Absolutely.
The Free State Project is built on the idea that I guess a different way of achieving it by people getting up and moving and coming to populate a free state. But if you don't have to give up your home, if you can just move an imaginary line and get get to live in a state of relative freedom. Of course, I have to say, New Hampshire will always be number one for freedom. I'm sure, even though I do have some good friends out in Idaho, like Dan McKnight, who leads the Defend the Guard effort. When I was in Maine, we had arguments about who had the best potatoes, but anyway, neither here nor there. But I think it's inspiring what you guys are doing, how far you've come, and I know that there's I think there's a lot for all of us in different parts of the country in our various struggles for political and individual freedom, who can learn a lot from what you're doing. I want to give you the final word. Any final thoughts you want to share with folks, and where can people learn more about the Greater Idaho Movement?
Yeah, thank you, Eric. I appreciate it. You know, we were talking strategy, and what is the strategy? Part of what needs to happen, we've been trying to convince our Western Oregon neighbors to let us go, peacefully let us go, because it's going to be a win for everybody. But we're running up against a roadblock. We're going to need some pressure from everybody else in our country to say, you know what, this isn't right. This is not okay. If the people in that place say they want to join another state, it's not okay to hold people captive against their will when they've said we want to go. So we need the rest of the country to say, hey, Oregon, what are you doing out there? You know, what are you doing keeping these people captive against their will? And an opportunity to come on a show like yours and talk to people, freedom-loving people who want to just associate with like-minded people and have government that makes sense for their families. This is exactly the kinds of people that we need on our team. So people can learn more about us and go support us at greateridaho.org. They can follow us on Twitter and join our, you know, we're on all the normal social media sites, greateridaho.org, and sign up to get our newsletter or whatever else. And you know, anything that they can do to help, you know, amplify our message and get out there across the country that, hey, there's people right here in the United States who are being held captive, politically captive against their will. That shouldn't be, that isn't right. Let's change that, and let's bring some pressure on those elected leaders to do the right thing.
Self-determination, it's the most American thing. It's what we were founded on.
Absolutely.
And shame on us if we don't recognize it anymore.
Yeah. All
right. Well, thank you, Matt, for joining the show. And I really look forward to seeing what comes next for the Greater Idaho Movement.
Thank you, Eric.
All right, everyone, that's the show. Boy, there's a lot to digest there. I think that's fascinating what's happening out there in Eastern Oregon. And, you know, it reminds me a little bit, you know, 20 years ago, the folks in Killington, Vermont voted that they wanted to break away and join New Hampshire. And, you know, similar situation over in Oregon when your political leaders won't let you go. We call that a hostage situation. So to the folks, the governor of Oregon and the political leaders of Oregon, let go of your hostages, and the same goes to the political leaders in Vermont. And if the folks in Maine want to start a conversation, I've spoken with a few folks in Maine about ideas like this, and people are surprisingly receptive when you bring it up, because people are getting increasingly desperate as they feel the government that they would like to have slipping out of their fingers as their freedoms and their paychecks are stolen from them more and more every single year and every single election cycle. These are the conversations that we need to be having, and I really appreciate that we got to have this conversation today. All right, everyone, thanks for joining us. One final thing I will mention. I think I mentioned it on last week's episode. If you are in New Hampshire, do you like Star Wars? Do you like Shakespeare? How about a mashup of them both? At the Shell Clubhouse on Sunday, September 15th at 1:30 p.m., we are doing a play reading of William Shakespeare's Star Wars: A New Hope. It's going to be a lot of fun. Admission is free. We're just reading a book, but we've got all your favorite Free Staters, or a lot of your favorite Free Staters are going to be reading parts. You're going to hear Luke and Leia and Darth Vader and C-3PO like you've never heard them before in a iambic pentameter. Come out and join us for a fun afternoon. And you can find out more details on that and all of our community events that are happening in the Free State on our community calendar at fsp.org. All right. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, as always, to our technical producer, Renita, for running things behind the scenes. Furthermore, my opinion is the Federal Reserve should be destroyed.